Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking geographic risk, climate risk, and even geographic arbitrage. Location matters more than ever before. Not just at the country level with geopolitics, not just even at the regional level with climate change, but also at the geographic coordinate level when it comes to extreme weather events that are increasing in frequency and intensity. This has obviously been a story long focused on by real estate, by insurance companies, but it's also a story that's going to start really affecting the commodities sector, as our guest outlines for us. Our guest is Michael Ferrari, Chief Scientific Officer and Chief Investment Officer at AlphaGeo, a climate resilience platform focused on spatial risk and resiliency. As always, you can really support the show by leaving a positive review on the platform you're listening on. It really does help amplify the show and therefore continue to get great guests. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me.
We're covering a topic today that I guess probably isn't one that features or has historically featured particularly high on all of the risks and concerns of a commodity leader, but is certainly going to become more prevalent as we go forwards in a more disrupted world, both politically, economically, but also from a climate standpoint as well. And this is this concept of how crucial location is, and always has been, particularly in the commodities world, access to rivers and ports and so forth. But now actually even getting more granular on that, down to the actual location on a, square footage on a map, right? And how key that's starting to become. So let's just, I guess, start at the top, which is essentially, can you give us some sense of kind of how businesses have traditionally thought about where they locate and the traditional risks that they were considering?
Sure, and I think you started off on a really good point. Is these concepts around the where question. These have always been important, but oftentimes they've been neglected in terms of a real thoughtful analysis in terms of how commodities move and how we move commodities around the world. So the risks always have a location focused. In the commodities world, we're always focusing typically on kind of the supply or the demand side of the equation, and the risks are typically, once they are brought to the market, we think about what risks are priced in and what risks are probably on the fringe of being priced in, and then those are kind of out on the beyond the scope of where the analysis can take us. And we're starting our analysis really from answering that where question. And whether it's, when you think about commodities, whether it's something that's grown or extracted or synthesized or transported or distributed, there always is a geographic question around that, and it always is tied to some location, and in the geospatial world, we kind of just put that as a reference point on a map. But I think a lot of time the market discounts that, and those of us that have been in this space, we've always known it's important. It just seems like in recent years we look about, when we talk about geographic risk kind of touches everything. It's not just commodities, it's climate, it's politics, it's geopolitics, it's supply chains, it's everything. And if anything has taught us from think about all the disruptions that have happened to supply chains over the last few years, I think the geographic component has really been highlighted. So again, it's always been there. And sometimes, as we all know, it takes an event to get things on people's radar. And so whether it was COVID or whether it was climate disruption or any number of these choke points in the supply chain that have impacted both the supply and the demand side of the equation, it's becoming more commonplace now. So we feel we have a head start because we've actually been doing analysis from this perspective for years, but it seems like it's becoming more mainstream, which is actually a good thing.
Just before we sort of move on to kind of the genesis of geospatial risk and really factoring that in, and particularly obviously from a real estate industry standpoint, discounting the risks in traditional commodities, right? So, location to access to ports, rivers, proximity to the resource you're extracting, and so forth. What are the main categories of risk that any business would look at when they're looking to locate in a particular spot on a map or country or whatever it is?
That certainly could be a subjective question. I think if you asked 5 different people, you get 5 different answers. From the perspective that I look at, I'm always looking at climate. There's climate touches everything. So there's definitely a climate risk. There's definitely a geopolitical risk, particularly when we're getting into global commodities. There's always a geopolitical element there. Sometimes it's a little, under the surface, and then, it becomes an issue and everybody knows about it. So the ones we always focus on really are climate, geopolitics, and broadly, when we're thinking about supply chain risks, when it comes to, not just sourcing, but sourcing, distribution, and transport. Those are kind of the three elemental areas that, that I tend to put, if I had to bucket them into groups, those are kind of the buckets that I place them in.
And on that political risk piece, it's not just obviously between countries, it's also within the particular jurisdiction that you're in as well, where we're just seeing, more and more volatility, right? Obviously in the news at the moment is, of course, all of the various changes to the laws around abortion, for example, in the US. And, you might find yourself very quickly in a state or even a county or wherever it might be in the world where the regime has changed quite quickly. And that itself is becoming less stable and more volatile in the Western world, that perhaps you could discount historically that these events wouldn't happen, and suddenly you find out your corporate HQ's having an exodus, or your facility is suddenly understaffed.
And that's a good point too, Paul, because when you have a geopolitical risk, it's a very broad category, and even the buckets that I put them in, when we think about climate, geopolitics, and supply chain, they're really, if you think about the barriers between them, they're permeable barriers, because climate is going to influence the geopolitical risks, and geopolitics are going to influence supply chain and vice versa. So it's almost cyclical, as opposed to kind of building a risk model in each area and then stitching them together. The factors from one easily spill over into the other categories, and they also feed back into the primary category. And then as well, when we're talking about geopolitics, it's not just country versus country, or regions within countries. It's foreign exchange. It's really how all these factors come together. So when we think about macro, I mean, and again, this is how I kind of view the world through the macro lens. I think of macro, and I think of all of these categories as equally important. And sometimes, if we kind of look at things through, at least in mathematical terms, we kind of bucket things into what we're calling principal components, right? So we might build models, or we might try to look for analogs where, okay, there's might be a certain region that we're looking at in the world, and let's just, for sake of argument, say we build a model and climate factors are your top principal components, meaning, you're building a model looking for attribution and climate factors are deemed most important. There might be another time of the year, that same commodity or that same category, climate might be number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I mean, it could be very lower on the list, but it's still important, right? And there just might be other factors that move and get a higher PC or a higher principal components type of score. And knowing kind of when to pull the levers and when to kind of weight certain factors more than others, I don't think that's ever going to be solved. I think it's an ongoing dialogue, but every day, and this is why, when we were kind of talking before the conversation, when you're studying this space, commodities in general, you almost have to be a student of everything, right? We can't just be thinking about your domain. You have to be thinking about the area that you might be focused on influences and is influenced by all these other factors. So it's always a rich field for discussion. It's always endlessly interesting. And there's always things that are happening tomorrow morning that I wasn't thinking of last night. So there's always things happening in the world that can either confirm an analysis or and a thought process that we might want to deploy, as well as there could be another factor that we're not thinking of that can just completely shatter that thought process, and you kind of have to rebuild, retest your assumptions, and always be learning. So it's I just find it endlessly interesting.
Yeah, and we should say, and I'll note at the start of this, you have a background in commodities, which is how we're linking these two things. But the central conceit here is essentially that you could probably have historically a wider aperture, a more helicopter view roughly of where you locate any given facility. But actually now, rather than it being kind of, okay, well, it's roughly in a 400 square mile area, it's now getting so granular in terms of events and so forth that it really does matter the specific site. And the sector that has obviously been ahead of this trend the two sectors have been certainly real estate and rates and all the rest of it that come off that, but also obviously the insurance sector. In that context, using them as the example, as the vanguard of this, can you give us some sense of what do you mean by climate, and some examples of kind of climate and how they're starting to think about where they locate their tower block, their warehouse, the port, etc.?
Sure. There's numerous examples that are in front of us every day, and they're very topical right now. So one, let's just think about AI, right? And obviously there's a lot of discussion around what's going to happen with the technology sector, where they're going to site facilities. The advent and the proliferation of large language models obviously are going to have a huge energy requirement. There's also going to be a very significant water requirement. So let's just kind of break this down to, even though we're thinking about the technology world and what technologies are going to enable economies to flourish, they also are going to require energy and water. And where 10, 15 years ago, it just seems like data centers and they were popping up wherever they were meaningfully close to the operational center, without really a thought of really those externalities in the form of energy and water. We're seeing that shift now, right? So we've seen, just in recent years, we've seen a little bit more foresight going into where facilities are going to be located, what that life of, that commercial viability, that commercial life of that property is going to look like. And there's a real thought process behind it. It used to be just, look at a facility, kind of draw that year over year, expect 4, 5, 6% increased demand year over year, and draw a straight line between now and 15 years from now. Now, there's a little bit more thought on, okay, well, is there going to be enough water in the regions that we're looking to site these facilities to satisfy the demand? Is there going to be enough energy, and not just energy, is there going to be enough clean energy? I mean, all of these, I was saying earlier, all of these subject areas, they all, touch one another, and so as we're going through this energy transition of electrifying everything, as that's happening, is there still going to be enough, of a shift towards clean and reliable and sustainable energy in the locations where we're looking to site these facilities? So that's one example that we're seeing. Another one, which is different, which is purely on the raw material side. Let's think about the food and beverage space. And if you're a bottler, you look to where you're going to locate your facilities. And obviously, if you're in the beverage space, the lifeblood of your business is access to clean, fresh water. And a lot of facilities that may, again, in the maybe the aughts and maybe in the 2010s, you'd put a facility somewhere and they would look at the commercial life of that facility and assume that plentiful water supply is always going to be there. Right now, we're seeing that a lot of these potential locations where bottlers are looking to site a facility, they might only have 5, 6, 7 years of a sustainable water supply left to keep that facility running. So not only are the corporates using a different type of analytics to understand, what is that maximum potential yield in terms of water that's going to allow this facility to operate, but the banks that are providing loans to the facilities and the insurers that are insuring the facilities are starting to take a different look at, just again, not just looking at year over year premiums, but let's look at how we're going to price this risk and understand what that risk curve looks like not just 1, 2, 3 years in the future, but 5, 10, 15 years in the future. So it's a very different dynamic, and we're starting to see a lot, particularly in the insurance sector, take more of a forward-looking view and really kind of change their thought process on how they're assessing and underwriting risk in future years.
And that's a clear example of climate, right? And one wonders about all of these data centers in Arizona, which we would all think of as pretty dry.
Yep, but it's a good point. One point I just want to stress there, Paul, though, when we say climate, and this is one thing, a lot of times when we talk about the climate issue, everybody just focuses on kind of temperature and precip, right? And that, because that's when you look about what is driving the public-facing discussion, it's always about rising temperatures. But there is a human component to this too. So it's, climate may be exacerbating trends, and climate is going to be the physical driver, but we also have to look at climate in context with the human aspect. When climate is driving, hydrological patterns to change plus or minus in certain areas, and we're looking at, where these human populations are growing and what cities are expanding, the water requirement for those regions is also going to change too. So we have to look at the physical in the context of the technology and the human side. So I just want to make sure that that's something that's I'm always trying to stress, that it's very easy to get into this polarizing discussion on climate as we just think about the things that are driving most of the news cycles that we see. But we can't forget the human component, and that is equally, if sometimes more important.
The other sort of side of climate is you've got these long range trends that obviously now, whereas historically we basically, as you say, assumed the environment would be the same in 10 years' time as it is today, and that's no longer holding true necessarily. But the other, of course, is the increase in intensity and frequency of events,
Exactly.
flooding, hurricanes, drought as well. And we see it, so far this year, right, with incredible flooding in Dubai. You've seen flooding throughout, East Africa. You've got, flood events where I live, where we've had, chemical plants essentially flooded and then huge cleanup operations as a result. And this is we're seeing this play out, and unfortunately, from a commodity standpoint, but also where most humans live, most people live on the coasts, and most commodity infrastructure is situated on the coasts as well, or around water when it comes to ags and so on. How much is you've got that lens as well, right? The and I assume this is key for everyone, including the insurers, of course. The expectation of these events and how that also plays into citing your locations and even what countries you're going to operate in.
It's interesting because where we are, if we think about the tools that we have, and when I say we, I'm speaking purely on the technical side. When we think about trying to project and understand what might happen, it's less about, and you kind of touched upon this, it's less about what is the delta between today and 2030 or today and 2050. It's not necessarily just the difference between those 2 points, but it's the volatility that's going to happen between now and then. So, there is, as you kind of alluded to, there's been increased or decreased, depending on where we're located. There's been an increase or decrease in volatility. So it's not just the amount, if we're talking about water levels, it's not just the amount of water that's going to be available or the number of storms that are going to happen between now and the endpoint, but it's the frequency and the amplitude, right? It's the severity that tends to exert itself on, and again, it's not just the raw materials, but it's the entire end-to-end. If you think about ags, right, it's not just what's growing, but it's the upstream and downstream supply chain related to growing, processing, distribution, transport. So it goes well beyond just extracting that raw material or that commodity out of the ground. It really hits the entire supply chain. And what we have now is, I think, a generally accepted idea that we're not going to the world's moving away from deterministic modeling, right? So, and this is one of the challenges that again, in the climate risk space, we've always been talking about this, is no matter how you build a model, right? If you say that there's going to be a certain percentage risk, or there's going to be a trigger event that's going to have a number associated with it, however that is scored, whether it's root mean squared error or mean absolute error, or whatever your scoring measure is, it's always going to be incorrect. So instead of moving towards that deterministic number, a more appropriate way, and I think this is where kind of the groups where I sit and working with the insurers and the reinsurers work, we can kind of come together, is taking more of a probabilistic view of the likelihood of these types of events happening. So we're not going to be able to say within, with a significant level of precision, what is the exact number of storms, certain storms that exceed a certain energy threshold will hit a certain area, and what are the exact zip codes where that's going to happen. That's going to be beyond the limits of science, even with all of the advances that have been made in recent years. But what we can say, and what we're starting to see, is what is the likelihood of these types of events to happen, and what time frame may they happen in. And what this also does, though, it includes the information in the tails, right? So a traditional probability distribution, you kind of look at everything, and then you kind of chop off the tails as outliers or extreme events. But now I think it's more accepted, and a more proper analysis is looking at every data point, right? All the possibilities that can happen, including those, high impact, low probability events that don't happen very often, but when they happen, they cause significant disruption. And I think it's a more, so we sacrifice a little on the precision, but we, in terms of being prepared and, working with risk managers in terms of understanding both climate and commodity risk together, I think it's a more appropriate way to view the world. Because again, there's always going to be risks that are unfolding that we're not going to be able to foresee and we're not going to be able to model. But if we can idealize and understand, what the potential looks like, that entire space of possibilities, then, reacting and preparing to react becomes a simpler exercise.
One of my dreams to have Nassim Taleb on the podcast. So it's interesting to hear, that those tails aren't being discounted, because of course those are the most significant outcomes. Just, I guess, before we talk about tools and obviously a bit contextualized in the ags world, if you just sort of step back and you look at sort of, for example, LNG, right? All of those, it by definition is coastal in terms of liquefaction and regas. And, what I'm most familiar with, of course, is along the Gulf Coast, Texas and Louisiana coast, you've got multiple liquefaction, multi-billion-dollar facilities built or being built or going for going for permissions. How much has this kind of thinking factored into citing those? And is there a recognition that actually, okay, you'll perforce need to be in these locations, so we're going to have to harden them? I mean, or is this still sort of relatively confined as a concept to, insurers, to the commercial real estate space? I mean, how far down the thinking have all these organizations gone? Because these are obviously 10, 15-year projects in the making. And when you started them, you probably weren't thinking that that area of the Gulf Coast is so much more vulnerable to hurricanes and flooding than it was when you started.
I mean, I would love to say it's the former, but it actually probably is more of the latter. Yeah, and the reality is, and we see this. I mean, I think it's starting to at least creep into the psyche of the corporates that are either in the process of citing or thinking about where to cite. I think they all know that there's risks there, whereas maybe, again, if we pick a number, 7 to 10 years ago, it probably was not even part of the thought process. So now at least it becomes part of the discussion. I still don't think we're at a point where the information that's available is making a meaningful contribution to where to cite. So I think it'll be slow. And I think if I could just use an example that relates to that most people can probably relate to, look at property values in Miami, right? We all know at some point Miami will be underwater, or they're going to face significant challenges to maintain against rising sea levels. So I think we all know that's going to happen at some point. Yet everyone's still moving to Miami. A lot of the finance sector from New York has kind of moved to Miami and St. Petersburg, and they're all moving to Florida. So there's other factors that are driving valuations, right? So there still are other reasons for, on the commercial side, that it still may be a good investment in the short term. And then, at that point, there is going to be an inflection point where you kind of deal with the negative consequences later. So I would say to your example on the siting of LNG facilities, I think probably there is something similar there. I think, when margins are good and premiums are still high, there still is a commercial pull to continue to build and develop in areas where, it always has been. But at some point, and again, we don't know when, but at some point there will be this inflection point in the market where we'll realize that either A, it wasn't the right idea, or what will probably happen is, the industry is going to have to spend a lot more in terms of the reacting and, additionally building defenses and then mitigating, some of the issues that have kind of built up in the years that ensued and followed to that point. So, I'd like to think that it is proactive, but I just think it's very slow, and it's going to take a while before that really becomes part of the calculus.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because firstly, like Daniel Kahneman's work, right? Humans aren't particularly good at risk adjusting probabilities in the future, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They sort of, significantly discount them. And you see that, right? I mean, like, close to me obviously is Galveston, where on a high tide, seawater's bubbling up through the drains downtown, but still property values are extraordinarily high there along the seafront. And there probably is going to be a tipping point. And in fact, you referenced Miami. It seems that actually, that we might be at that tipping point in parts of Florida, driven actually
so, yes.
by insurance rates,
right? And I'm not even pointing fingers, right? Because that's human nature, right? I mean, so I think, everyone has these biases, these ways of thinking. So even with information, it's not to say that everybody who's doing things wrong. That's just the way people think. But I do think that there will be a point. We are starting to see, some cracks in the armor, and we're starting to see some signs that, it may be good to take a different approach towards at least, thinking on how to develop these areas, and maybe even more importantly, how to insure them.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
Well, the challenge for commodities is, of course, that it is essentially lowest cost of production game, right?
Yep.
And therefore the entire calculus is on, proximity to resource or proximity to port. I mean, it makes absolute sense to have the LNG liquefaction plants as close as possible to Texas and Houston and the major because that's where the gas is flowing to, right? And you're not going to be able to compete if you're going going to the west coast or to more protected areas inland, as well as your next nearest competitor. There is an argument, though, of course, that actually in this concept that site now really, really matters, that if you're the mega hurricane comes through or the event happens and you're the one facilities that are up and running, and we saw this in actually those organizations that hardened generation in Storm Uri in Texas when the big freeze, and globally there's multiple examples. I don't want to make this so US centric, but if you are the facility that's sited best and survives and weathers it, that's a huge advantage for a period of time as well, right? So I assume, is that calculation being made as well or even thought about?
I'm seeing a little more on the agriculture side, to be honest. I haven't, first of all, I spend more of my time on the ag side than energy anyway, but still, even when I still talk with a lot of the producers, and I don't get a sense that is still, again, it's not driving the decisions. I am seeing a little bit more thought go into that in terms of agriculture, but I think by nature, it's understandable why we can do it in agriculture because, unlike natural resources that are buried beneath the ground, although there are different belts where we can, obviously you can substitute crops, you can grow certain things, you can shift growing regions to other areas. You're still limited by climate, obviously. You can't just pick up and grow, things that are used to a temperate climate and grow it in a colder climate and vice versa. But, there still is a little bit of flexibility in terms of the varieties you can plant, the types of seed you can use, the types of crop protection materials you can use and apply to those fields and how those fields are managed. So the grower, as opposed to the LNG facility site coordinator, has a little bit more flexibility in terms of the human element in terms of how to operate that and what the substitutes are. So I am seeing a little bit more, I think, foresight on the ag side, but it's still moving slowly, but there has been movement.
Yeah, I guess that's a critical piece and will become more critical, right? If you're thinking about investing in cocoa or whatever it might be, sugar for ethanol, there are going to be countries that have a better or a less risky climate profile. There are also going to be regions within those countries that have a less risky climate profile that perhaps it wasn't in any former equation, right? And I guess that's where the smarter organizations are really thinking about this. People are trying to amortize a deal over 20 years.
Yeah, and again, we're seeing this. My sense is those that are, and let's just use cocoa as an example. I started my career with Mars, so that was kind of my first foray into the commodities world is the global cocoa trade. And and let's look at what's happening in cocoa right now, right? I mean, you have a significant amount of volatility. 2/3 of the world's cocoa, even a little bit more than that, comes from two countries in the world. And when they have a precarious or adverse weather event, it can cause real havoc in terms of both the supply and the demand side. Now, obviously, when there's significant volatility, like we've seen over the last month, went up, went down. So, we don't really know what what is a fair value for cocoa today. But these kind of things, what they're doing is they're forcing companies to look at other origins to develop. And cocoa is an example of a commodity that takes a long time to develop, just because typically cocoa it's not grown in plantations. It's grown under shade, so you have to find the right cover crops that you're going to grow and develop a cocoa plantation under. But even more importantly, cocoa is very susceptible to disease, and so there's been even back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, companies like Mars and others were looking to really develop other origins, so the world wasn't so solely dependent on this small little slice in West Africa where most of the material is coming from. And here we are 30, 40, 50 years later, and there are other origins that have been developed. However, still most of the world's cocoa still comes from those two countries. So it's sometimes very difficult to translate what makes sense from kind of an academic exercise into something that actually works in the real world. And cocoa is a perfect example of some of those challenges. And then, not to mention, on top of just the physical and the biophysical challenges to cocoa, you also have unstable governments and unstable currencies, and the amount of, basically the amount of material that is counted as one country that's coming from another country due to, just kind of porous borders. So it's, there's a whole, series of challenges that layer on top of just the purely physical and biophysical side. So, again, I see progress, but it's slow, and,
Well,
we're
I
kind of
imagine
living
it's,
through it.
you'll end up in sort of, a state of sort of stasis
Yeah,
as every location in, that when you start sort of bringing in all those risks, it's business on hard mode, right? And it always has been in commodities, which is
absolutely.
part of why I think we all find it so fascinating. And as you're weaving in all of those three big large buckets of risk. And it comes back to this idea of not only country, but even location within country, and even down to the exact coordinates, on the map. How do you get, and obviously this is, your platform, AlphaGeo, how do you start coalescing all of this data? What data is available, right? How do you start putting into data political risks and so on, to start getting this picture that is a lens that clearly is going to become more and more important going forwards?
And there's a variety of ways. And this is what we're doing at AlphaGeo. This is really kind of an ongoing story. This is kind of, this again goes back to really when I started. Taking a differentiated view to both data and how data is used has always been an information advantage in commodities. And the information advantage today is a little different than it was 30 years ago, just because so much of the real-time information, as soon as it's an event, it's priced in. And so the speed that information moves, that evaporation, that advantage is kind of evaporated in recent years. However, where I think a lot of data still has not really been fully utilized, and what we're trying to do and what others that are kind of in this space are trying to do is combine data in different ways. There might not be, it's almost the world of synthetic data, right? So that we have about, in our platform today, we have roughly 1,500 individual data streams that go into our assessment of risk and resilience. And then we go through a series of feature engineering and feature selection processes to identify, here's the question that we're asking. What are the most material data points that can inform us to make a decision about that decision point? So obviously, we don't build a model that has 1,500 data streams in it. We'll find the ones and that, through our own internal machine learning process, and we'll identify which variables are most important. But then what we're always doing is we're always testing those assumptions. So it's not a static number. As soon as new information becomes available, we can ingest that data, recalculate, and then either one of two things. We can have more conviction about the decision that we originally made, or we can adjust our assumptions. And we're always, able to reevaluate and, extend that window that we're looking for, because as more information comes out, we can just extend that forward view another time step or another series of time steps. So it becomes more of a fluid process as opposed to just a static, here's the forecast, here's the number, we wait for the number to verify and then move on. And then when it comes to kind of data, it really is a mix. So we have, again, of that 1,500 so data sources that we ingest, it's a mix of public and private. So a lot of data that anybody in the world has access to. If you have access to the internet, you can basically download a lot of the data that we're pulling because it's freely available to everybody. But there are other sources that we do buy. There are other sources that are proprietary. But what becomes, I feel, is even more important than, because a lot of groups try to build their moat around the data itself. I find that it's more important to be more creative what we do with our data, right? So when I, kind of talked a little bit before about creating synthetic data, we'll have data from a variety of different sources, and we can analyze it and slice it and dice in different ways and almost generate our own indices that we find have material relevance for a particular commodity in a particular region under a particular time duration. And that may not work for the same commodity. That's the same series of data, the same factors that drive the decision point for that question. They may be different than even a similar crop, but in different geography, right? Because there's other factors that are, the combination of those factors together actually lead to an answer or a series of answers that we find to be more compelling in a different geography, even though we might be looking at the same crop. So it really almost becomes a bespoke from the user or from the endpoint, the customer or the client perspective. It becomes a bespoke answer to them. But the data and the process really is a systematic process on our side. And the only thing that we're doing differently is we're deciding which questions we want to ask and why are these questions important. So those are the levers that we're pulling. And that becomes more of a, just a process on our side of the fence. And then on our customer side, it becomes something that is particular to their exposure and their profile. So it's a very interactive process, but I'm finding that, the sweet spot here is almost creating our own indices and creating our own series of data that, are not necessarily easily, reverse engineered, or they're not necessarily going to do something that's going to be replicated just by having access to the same data.
You also have an index as well, right? I mean, are we actually seeing this play out in theory, that those organizations that are thinking about this, locating in more resilient locations, from those big buckets of risk, are actually performing better?
We are, and again, it's slow. You don't see, when it comes to property valuations, it's not like, commodity prices, right? Where any given day something could, cause a 10, 20, or 30% plus or minus deviation in prices. So real estate tends to be more range bound. But if you take a longer view, and if we kind of back test some of the things that we're looking at, even as recently as 5, 6, 7 years ago, and then look to kind of see what was the difference between our baseline assessment and the delta between what the, that risk adjusted valuation is, you're actually starting to see some of these, this thesis play out, and see appreciation in areas that we would think would appreciate, and depreciation in areas that we think will be negatively impacted. So it's part of a longer story. I mean, I think the key here, which a lot of times, again, in the commodity world, you don't have the luxury to have time, you don't necessarily have that time duration on your side. Real estate, and when it comes to particularly that real estate footprint, that geographic footprint on the ground, you do have a little bit more time. You can be a little bit more patient in terms of investor to see, is this going to appreciate? Is this the right investment, and will this pay off? And will I start to see my return in 5, 6, 7 years? So obviously in commodities, you don't always have the luxury to do that. Although I could argue that forward-thinking commodities groups probably should be thinking along those lines. But particularly on the geographic footprint piece, we absolutely are seeing some of this play out, and we'll expect it to, continue to to unfold the way we're envisioning this in the years to come.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when you think about it, there's almost a bifurcation of goals here, because a commodity participant wants to make sure hard assets in the ground, some of them very expensive, refineries, liquefaction plants, are based in resilient areas. But almost the nature of a commodity trader is they want to be in more volatile markets.
Right.
So
right.
you might
they have a
also
book to manage, right? Yeah. I mean, I sat in that seat. I know exactly that. It's very conflicting.
Yeah. Well, you might also want to therefore look at the sort of the obverse of your resiliency data and say, well, if we want to participate in a power market, the best one to be in is Brazil or Japan,
right.
because that's where the most volatile events are happening and the most opportunity could be captured as well, right? You could use the reverse of the goal somewhat.
Oh, absolutely. Which again, which is what makes the commodity world so interesting, right? You kind of have these competing forces acting upon any decision that you're trying to make, and at different times of the day or different times of the year, you might make different decisions with the same data, because you have different drivers.
Yeah. Well, I've enjoyed it. I mean, it's obviously quite nascent, but I just thought it was a fascinating lens that we haven't really covered, this idea of geographic spatial risk. And actually, probably over the long term, we are going to see this becoming more and more of a factor. And it does particularly have a challenge for this sector, again, because of the cost focus, but also because of how anchored you are to certain geographic features and so forth. And, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
I think it will too. I mean, if we think about if we kind of wanted to lump it under a term, the increase in geographic arbitrage is really where I'd like to see this go. And again, we're starting to see signs that it's moving in that direction. And we're hoping that this can be. We know that we're not trying to change the way the whole market thinks, but if we can provide a different lens that medium to long duration investors can look and kind of use this geographic arbitrage as one of the guiding tenets in terms of making a decision. Then to me that's success.
Yeah, well, there you go. We've just come up with the title for the episode. But well,
there we go.
Michael, it's been a real pleasure having you on. I'll put links to AlphaGeo in the show notes for people who are interested. And if you go on there, you can see a map of resiliency. And unfortunately, where I live is shaded very, very dark blue, which is not a good thing. But it's been a real pleasure, and hopefully have you back on in a couple of years and see where this trend has advanced.
Well, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.